Tim Nichols to you. They are brothers and co-owners of Mr. Maple. Matt and Tim are both past presidents of the North American Maple Society and have a lifetime of experience studying these amazing trees. Matt and Tim are passionate about sharing their maple obsession through daily videos on the Mr. Maple Show YouTube channel. I already subscribed to that. And their weekly podcast, MrMaple.com. They've been featured on many TV shows, from Growing a Greener World to Tokyo TV in Japan. Their nursery has been recommended in Southern Living Magazine, Garden Design, Our State, and Country Gardens, among many other publications. MrMaple.com is at the forefront of cultivar evaluations through their Area 51 introduction program. They proudly provide the highly sought after and newly cutting edge plants from Dragon Master to Firefall, evaluated and named at their farm. Their family-owned nursery spans multiple generations and continues to be on the cutting edge of every aspect of Japanese maples. Let's welcome Matt and Tim Nichols.
Howdy, I'm Matt. I'll be a little low there. Normally you need this one to mute me down and to bring Tim's voice up. So if you didn't get enough of us, if you were at the first session and now the second session, and you're like, I'm not sick of these guys, you can definitely go check us out on the YouTube channel if you need more Mr. Maple content, if that wasn't enough.
Hey guys, I'm Tim. Thank y'all for coming in today. You know, we're talking about Japanese maples. That's our passion. Our grandmother started growing Japanese maples in the 1950s. She never tried to sell them, but she lined them out in rows, and eventually landscapers started coming and asking her, hey, can I buy a Japanese maple? And it was crazy because my grandma first said no, but then she started looking, and those rows were getting crowded. And then she said, sure. And so she never really tried to sell, but initially she started selling Japanese maples as, you know, balled and burlap, but they would have to ball and burlap it and fill the hole back in with dirt. So in our area, she started providing Japanese maples to some local landscapers, not really out of trying to, just because she loved them. My dad started growing Japanese maples in the 1970s.
On the other side of the family.
On the other side of the family. Didn't even know my mom or my grandma who was growing Japanese maples, and he was just digging up seedlings. And then it ended up being that me and Matt took our dad's passion, grew it. I mean, when we took this nursery over from Dad, his revenue for 1 year, total gross revenue, was like $3,000 or $4,000. So,
we started out selling at tailgate markets, hoping for gas money. So we've talked a lot about Japanese maples over the years, and we've continued to expand from there. Now we're, if you were at the earlier talk, you probably know a little bit about us, but we were primarily mail order. We ship all over the United States, and we do around 1,400 different varieties of Japanese maples. And for that reason, a lot of people send us cool and interesting plants to evaluate. We've actually named a few. We get accused of naming a lot more than we have because we help make so many different trees popular. We may find a tree, in a backyard in Alabama that was sold regionally, but it's something we start producing and then it's kind of everywhere. So we have helped popularize some trees, but didn't name quite as many as people think we've named.
But we have started our Area 51 process here at Mr. Maple, where we name and evaluate Japanese maples. And we've actually got a lot of trees in that pipeline, and it's a very long process. We have over 1,400 different varieties of Japanese maples at Mr. Maple. One of the largest selections, the largest selection in the United States, one of the largest selections in the world. And we put the trees through a very rigorous process of evaluation. I mean, we go through and we try to name we look at the plant for a minimum of about 6 to 8 years, and then we look and see, what is the 5 closest plants to it, and how is it similar, how is it different, and what are the improvements on that plant.
And if you can't answer that question, hey, maybe we shouldn't be producing this one. We don't need 1,405. We need 1,405 good ones. So we try to help cut that down. And then at our nursery, we only produce the things that really impress us. We do get a lot of people that are like, hey, you've really got to grow this tree. I've named it after my Aunt Sue, and she's awesome. Aunt Sue's great. And then they send us a picture of it, and we're like, that's Bloodgood. That looks exactly like Bloodgood. There's a lot of red uprights. How is this different than Bloodgood? Oh, it was a seedling from Blood Goods. Like, yep, seen that one already. So we try to eliminate some of the things that don't necessarily need to be in the trade, and promote the things that do. And what our calling card is really kind of the more rare and unusual stuff. So we do sell a lot of the things you'll find at the big box stores, but we also try to make it more niche. Like our niche all along has been trying to produce things that you don't find everywhere else. So that's kind of what we talk about a little bit today too.
And so for us, we're MrMaple.com. That's our mail order business. We ship directly to people's door. But then we also do the Mr. Maple Show on YouTube. Now, this is full of information of cultivars. We do cultivar highlights where we go out and talk about plants directly in front of the trees. Or we go visit gardens and talk about trees in the gardens. We also go around and do a lot of, hey, what are these spots on my leaves on the Japanese maple during the summer? And so we do a lot of answering questions that you may be commonly getting to your garden center or your nursery. And we put a lot of that good information out there on our YouTube channel. You can go out there and view that anytime.
Currently, one of the best books, I had somebody ask earlier, what's some of the best books on Japanese maple? Peter Gregory's 4th edition is a great book to buy on Japanese maples. We'll be doing one eventually, but we actually have more trees than you'll find in the 4th edition on our video format. So you can get a lot of good information there as well. We also do some really cool podcasts. So we do a podcast all the time. If you're really a Japanese maple fanatic, you'll know Talon Buchholz has named a lot of interesting trees. We did a podcast with him. So people like that we like to kind of get some of our people that have inspired us and some of our heroes on there and talk to them and ask them questions about their different plants and things like that. So.
And if you like maples, you're geeky like us, you check out the Maple Society. Maple Society is a great group of people who love Japanese maples, love maples. It's a great way to learn about it. Matt and I are both past presidents of the Maple Society, so you can definitely check that out.
Typically, every year it changes coast for the meetings. So, like next year, I believe it's in Oregon, but then the following year they'll try to pick an East Coast city. And the current president was like, "Hey, we need some more members in this area," so we're definitely making a plug for it. And it's every 3 years they do an international meeting. So there's typically an international meeting. And met a lot of really cool people through going to Belgium to the international meeting, things like that. So,
but check us out on YouTube and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform because there's a lot of cool information. So now we're into the maples. So the very first one we got up here, this is a Japanese maple I love. We love the Acer Japonicums here at Mr. Maple. The full moon maples really add a lot in the landscape and garden. This is Acer Japonicum Akamote, also known as Acer Japonicum Ruby.
Yeah, our good friend Ed Shin, he kind of coined the phrase blushing with Blushing Beauty. He has a cultivar called Blushing Beauty that has red hues over it. And I think it's an apt way to describe the different colors of Acer Japonicum. You're not going to come out with like an Emperor One red Acer Japonicum, at least not currently. But you get these really cool shades of blushing over top of that. So it has these green undertones, but you get some really nice like bright reds to orange blushing on Akamote over top of that. Makes an awesome palette for that spring color. Now, we love Acer Japonicums. They're kind of a species of Japanese maple that are very popular. You'll see Acer Japonicums and Acer Shirasawarum sold as full moon maples. They have those large round leaves. Acer Japonicums are often some of the best fall color maples you'll get too. They go through some amazing color changes. There's not too many cultivars. There's probably only about 30 or so cultivars of Acer Japonicum, but they're really interesting plants and they can provide a ton of fall interest.
Yeah, Acer Japonicums just hold on their leaves for about 2 weeks longer than typical Acer Palmatums. That gives you a better fall color out there in the landscape and garden. And often on an Acer Japonicum, you can get really large leaves on many of the cultivar selections. So you can get some really large leaves that sometimes can be dinner plate in size that can really put on a great display in the fall.
So we love this one because it gives you even added spring interest on that Akamote. You'll see a lot of reoccurring words. Like, I don't speak Japanese fluently by any means. I took a class at our local community college in Japanese, and all I learned was that I know nothing. And so it helped me a little bit with Romanji. You can kind of guess, some of the proper pronunciations. Now, Aka is a word you'll see a lot reoccurring, and it basically means a light or bold red. So you'll see that happen a lot.
So next up is a plant that we introduced here at Mr. Maple.
Yeah, Acer Palmatum Dragon Master. Now, this is a weeping yellow form of Ryusin or Ryusei, if you've heard us talk about that before. This is one of our favorite yellow weeping forms. So this is going to have that extremely pendulous habit that you're familiar with Ryusin, but in a bright, bright golden habit. I almost like to think of this one as a orange dream, if you're familiar with orange dream coloration, times like the Ryusin shape.
And it does have some more of that orange color when it first leaves out. Excellent for hanging baskets or pots. If you saw us talk about growing them in hanging baskets in the last presentation, this is a great one to be able to do that with. It's one that if you push the sunlight a little bit, you get more of those bold yellows with Dragon Master. And it was kind of crazy because Golden Falls, I guess, would be a similarly type plant. I mean, they're both yellow and weeping, but at the same time Talon was introducing his Golden Falls, we're introducing Dragon Master, found on separate occasions.
I would say they're both weeping forms, but they're different in color as much as Katsura and Orange Dream as well. So they're in a much larger leaf on the Dragon Master, and a little bit more colorful on Dragon Master as well.
Yeah, and for us, this plant here, if you just push it just a little bit of sunlight, those bold yellows really stand out. This is actually pushing sunlight in Oklahoma, and as you can see there, it's really gives that bright, intense yellow color.
Purple Ghost is always a classic. Many of you probably know this one. We like to include some of the Ghost series in any of our presentations. Talon Buckholz really helped make the Ghost series popular. In fact, before the Ghost series, most of this style variegation was referred to as reticulatum. And people would say, oh, that's more of a reticulatum style Japanese maple. And now I think Talon, he doesn't really name too many ghosts anymore. I guess he got tired of everybody calling them ghosts. But even anywhere in the world you go, people will say that's more of a ghost type variegation, and they'll describe that variegation that way.
I like what Purple Ghost does, though, because it can give you some lavender colors to fuchsia colors when it comes out in the landscape. I mean, it is one of the most truly purple Japanese maples. There aren't any blue Japanese maples, no matter what the internet may say. So you can always tell all your customers, there's no blue Japanese maples.
I'm sure some of the garden centers get tired of that question all the time. People, it's slowed down. There was a time, probably 2 years ago, because of like people selling them online. It's mostly seeds from China, and they'll say, buy this blue Japanese maple, and they'll have like a perfectly neon, like metallic Japanese maple in a bonsai pot. It's like the best bonsai you've ever seen. And often I have a picture of that same tree at the Pacific Rim Bonsai Collection, and it's a green trident maple, and I'm like, here's the real tree, here's the Photoshop tree you see everywhere. So there's no blue Japanese maples, but purple, pretty crazy colors there still. I mean, this is actually a real color you can get on your foliage.
I will say there are even tons of Photoshopped Purple Ghost in a bonsai fashion. Those are fake as well. But as you can see here, we've got these fuchsia colors to this lavender color on the same plant, just different years it's leafing out in different ways. And it's crazy you can get that much variation of color on one plant, but it really gives you some really nice purples. In this middle photo here, that's actually the original Purple Ghost at the Floral Wonder Collection at Buckholz Nursery in fall color. We were visiting and it was in perfect fall color, and I was like, that's amazing.
Really bold reds. You can get even some darker reds on that one in the fall. Can get a little bit more green especially if you have it more sun in the summer. It'll green up a little bit, but really showy plant to be growing.
We're often asked what our favorite Japanese maple is, and this is up there. This grouping of plants, the Makawa Yatsubusa and its progeny, are some of our favorite Japanese maples.
That's really our cop-out answer, because we're not only saying Makawa, we throw in all the lineage from below that. So if you throw all that together, we can count that as one.
So from our presentation earlier today, both Red Panda and Kryptonite would fit in this category. But the Makawa Yatsubusa has that tightly layering shingle on a roof type growth, which is really unusual, really different, but it gives this fluffy, airy feel for a Japanese maple. It almost makes it seem alive.
Yeah, it gives it almost that, you could talk to it in the garden kind of quality. It's got that, it's looking at you kind of quality. It's tight and it's dense. We were once at a garden show and people said, have you seen our Dr. Seuss tree? Well, we do a cultivar called Acer Palmatum Dr. Seuss. So we're like, well, let's go check it out. I mean, it might be a Dr. Seuss. Well, it was a Makawa Yatsubusa because it looked like a Dr. Seuss creature there in the landscape. And you can see why. It kind of puts on these crazy arms, and really fun tree. Excellent fall color. It's a fiery orangey red in the fall, and it's really tough as nails. Everything we've talked about so far today is going to work typically zones 5 through 9. The zone system works great, but on the East Coast, but it's not a perfect system because it doesn't take into account heat indexes. We have customers in zone 10 California who can grow this in full sun, but they're not getting too high heat index and they're not getting too cold. So really, whenever we talk about zones really only take into account how cold a region is, not how hot it's getting.
So next up, we've got Acer Palmatum and Irene. Now, I love the color yellow. The yellow adds so much to the landscape and garden. What it does is allows you to be able to see more shades of green, and it contrasts against your reds and your your blues, and when you see it look in the landscape, you see every shade of green when you add yellow in there. If you look at with just a green background, it's solid green. You throw a yellow in there, and then all of a sudden, instead of seeing just the yellow, now you see light greens, dark greens, medium greens, forest greens. And so yellow does so much out in the landscape and garden. And Irene is a variegated sport on summer gold that was found in Holland. And so it's got all the same heat tolerance that you have with Acer Palmatum summer gold, but then you get a ruffled red edge to orange.
Yeah, that'll actually fade to like a cream on yellow. Really showy plant. If you follow our channel at all, you know Tim talks too much about yellow. In fact, our subscribers joke it's the Mr. Maple drinking game, and I wouldn't encourage that at all. You'll be done on like one episode. But we talk about yellow plants a lot, and it's because they do make the eye draw in. They make everything in the landscape look brighter. So if you have the yellows, the reds, and the greens, especially in that spring garden, are really intense. Now, Irene can get this kind of pink folded color, like you see on the left there. It gets more of a ruffled leaf, but late summer it's going to be a little bit more creamy. So it definitely fades to a lighter white cream. And we've been really impressed, like he was saying, with the durability of this one. I mean, we're in Zone 6B where our nursery's at in western North Carolina. I should have said that up front if you're wondering where the southern accents are from. But yeah, we're in western North Carolina. And we grow this one in full sun with great success, and I've heard really good things about people in Zone 8 with this one in full sun as well. So,
and for us, where we're at, you may get a little burn until the plant gets established, but then once it gets established, it's fine out in the landscape and garden and thrives and does really well.
Summer Gold's one of the few yellows we do recommend for sun, and Irene being a sport off of that. We've got one we'll talk about later that's also good in full sun, but in general, as a rule of thumb, the more pink or white or yellow you have in your tree, the more late day shade you'll need. Now there's some exceptions to that, but in general, those are the trees that'll need a little bit more late day shade.
So Acer Palmatum Celebration. This is one of our favorite Japanese maples, and it's also one of Talon Buckholtz's newest introductions. The guy who introduced the Ghost series, after a while, he quit putting the term ghost on many of his reticulated types that he was introducing. And Celebration just knocks it out the park with just some outrageous pink-red color.
Yeah, this one basically a neon pink purple ghost. So you're going to get a lot of what you liked about the purple ghost with that reticulated etching. Now by reticulation, what we mean is that each leaf has that highly defined interior marking. So you can kind of look at it. Oftentimes people refer to like the snake effect, like people that collect reptiles will know reticulation because that veining is often described. And that's exactly what you get with the Ghost series and some of its progeny like this. The Celebration has really defined etching in it, but also some just intense color changes. Like Tim was saying, bright pink in the early spring, fading a little bit to light pink with greener older growth, and then we've had some really bold, intense reds on this one in the fall as well.
And late summer, when you have like this green reticulated plant that's then pushing on pink-red new growth during the summer, I mean, it's a plant that grabs your attention in the summer. Mm-hmm. And as we all know, plants that attract customers in the summer are amazing because that's when a lot of times people are out there gardening.
This is Acer Palmatum Kamagata. Now, this is an older cultivar, not super old. I mean, Japanese maples have been around for a long time. One of the earliest lists on Japanese maples is from the 1700s in Japan. And we're actually going to do a podcast just on that 1700s list soon. Kamagata is actually one that J.D. Varieties is credited with introducing. It's one of the few he actually put his name on. Varieties wrote the first edition of Japanese maples for Timber Press. And a really nice compact tree with some really stringier new growth. So it's a denser one, but it's got that elongated lobes on it.
Now in his book, he describes that this name translates as eagle claw. And it's actually something that's incorrect in this book. Washinoo, which is the name of another Japanese maple, is actually what eagle claw is in Japanese. Kamagata is actually sort of like a dwarf woodland duck in Japan. But it really has some good spring interest with some nice long tips to it that give some nice purple border. If you give it some sunlight, you get that purple border a little bit longer throughout the season. But for me, this is a Japanese maple that's extremely heat tolerant. So if you've got something with a southwest exposure, that you've got something that needs, something that's just a little extra, right next to a brick house. I mean, we've got a brick house in western North Carolina where the southwest exposure, a lot of trees and plants wouldn't grow there. We threw Kamagata there and it just thrives and does well. It's a very drought tolerant and heat resistant plant that you can put in a lot of places that you normally don't think about.
Varieties actually recommends this one for rock gardens, so it's a very durable plant for that reason. You often have to be careful with rock. We do a whole video on this too, but rock can add heat, residual heat to your planter, or it can add residual heat to an area. But this is one that does tend to do pretty well with some heat.
And here, the main reason you wouldn't want to have that happen, that sounds like a good thing, but you don't want that plant leafing out too early in the spring. And if you're getting residual heat on a plant in the early spring, that may cause it to leaf out earlier and get damaged by some early frosts.
Strawberry Spring. This is another one of that reticulated form, really showy one. Strawberry Spring is going to be one of the more intense pinks. Again, it's a little bit different than that Celebration. It's more of a creamy center to it. Really showy though. Again, Talon decided to quit going with a Ghost series on it, so we call these the New Ghost. We did a whole series on the New Ghost, and I like the names on a lot of these. They're very creative. But yeah, this is one that really brings the high intensity pink and really a showy plant.
We're talking baby pink, and it's probably one of the most intense baby pink Japanese maples that we produce. This is a plant that will end up getting about 8 to 10 feet in height in 10 years, and it really puts on a show in the spring. Midsummer, it can go to more of this creamy white with green reticulation, and then in the falls typically goes to some bold reds, maybe some oranges in there before that. But for me, I like the high intense color Japanese maples because they can add so much in the spring garden to really, they're almost like flowering plants. I mean, when you have these intense colors, when you're playing with an Irene, Celebration, Strawberry Spring, you've got bold colors that distinguish themselves from everything else that's out in the landscape. So you can use them as a piece out in the landscape to brighten the landscape, but at the same time, they just provide so much contrast against each other. Those bold colors really seem to make the garden just pop.
Yeah, we had somebody ask earlier, and they were like, what's your best sales pitch if people are looking for flowering plants? And I remember some of our friends in Japan always say, like with Japanese maples, like the foliage is the flower. So remember that too. It's like the foliage kind of is the flower. There's some flowers on there too. Most, unless they're Acer Japonicums, aren't very noticeable. But the flower, the foliage can every bit replace the flower.
And you get it longer throughout the season.
So this is Acer Shirasawatum Sunny. This is a newer hybrid of Acer Shirasawatum. Again, that full moon maple. They've separated those out. So Japonicum and Shirasawatum are separate categories. We love Acer Shirasawatum. They're really unique plants. One of the reasons we love Sunny is you can get some really intense bold orange on this one, especially in the early spring. I definitely would recommend siting this one where it gets more late day shade because it goes from this orange to a bright, bright yellow.
I mean, if people are familiar with Acer Shirasawatum Jordan or Acer Shirasawatum Aureum, this is everything that you like about those plants during the summer, but you add this extra orange spring interest. So think of it almost like that Katsura style of an Acer Shirasawatum full moon Japanese maple. And as this tree matures out, the leaf gets more and more like the traditional Acer Shirasawatum. This was found as a chance seedling from Acer Shirasawatum Jordan, and that spring orange is just spectacular. Yeah,
really large round leaves on this one. It likely is a hybrid with Palmatum for some of that more vigor it has in it. It definitely has a little bit more vigor and growth than your typical Acer Shirasawatum straight species. A lot of the nurserymen will define a Shirasawatum because the seeds aim up. Now, I could think of a lot of exceptions to that rule. A lot of your old school guys will say, well, the seeds aim up, it's an Acer Shirasawatum. I've had that on a lot of seedlings from Makawa that are clearly Makawa, and a lot of cultivars too that would break that rule. But this one definitely likely has some Palmatum X hybrid heritage to kind of get all those colors in there, but also a ton of vigor.
Now, the Acer Shirasawatums are probably going to be really a great plants for a lot of people in Zone 5. When they had the polar vortexes, a lot of people in Zone 5, maybe some of their Palmatum selections got a lot of damage. The Acer Shirasawatums often are one of the species like the Acer Pseudosubuldianum that showed some of the least damage during those polar vortex times. So a lot of these Acer Shirasawatums that you're like, well, I've already got a yellow Palmatum. The Shirasawatums really add that extra dimension of cold hardiness to a Japanese maple.
Okay, so this is one that we love to talk about in all of our talks. Naka Komodo Weeping. It is a loosely estimated at around 400 years old. We saw some things that said upwards of 600 years old. I know when I was there, I had a translator. There was some markings on one of those posts you see, the stakes that are holding this tree up. And some of the stakes on that, note that the stakes were added around 200 years ago. So that's crazy to even think about. Really cool tree, though. We were on Nippo ni Kitai, which you might have heard me mention in the earlier seminar. Basically, the show means, the name means, who wants to come to Japan? And so we were invited over to this Japanese TV show where we went and talked about Japanese maples. And one of the days while we were there filming B-roll at Nakata-san's nursery, we were just playing with Google Translate and looking at stuff, and it said, we're less than 1 hour drive from the national treasure tree of Japan. What's that all about, right? And I knew there was a tree referred to as national treasure, and I knew it was a Japanese maple, so I'm like, I got to get to the bottom of this. Well, Nakata-san was so gracious while it was raining in a dreary day. He took us, and they made the translator go everywhere with us because they were afraid we were going to get lost. They're like, these guys have been to Japan before, and they're way too eager to get out there and do stuff, and they're going to go get lost, and we paid to get them here. So don't lose these guys. So that was his job. But it was perfect for us because we were allowed to drag this guy along and go like, hey, what does this mean? Hey, what does this mean? Hey, what does this mean? So we had a translator with us everywhere we went. And a really cool plant to see. Often, we talk about Japanese maples in terms of time after a certain amount of years, and that's why we do. I often tell people if you plant this tree, hey, in 400 years it could look exactly like this. But that's why we talk about Japanese maples in terms of 10 to 15 year increments typically for the height, because a happy Japanese maple will outlive us all.
And that's often why we think that with the Japanese maple, the term maturity may be misleading because there are so many different definitions of maturity. Some people use a 10-year size. Some people use a 20-year size. Some people use the size, as the guy who wrote the book on Japanese maples, as the biggest that I've ever seen. And what that does is when you take that approach, all the new cultivars are dwarfs and all the old cultivars are giants, but they may have the same growth rate. And so it's very misleading whenever it comes to the term maturity. So we always try to give that 10 to 15 year size so people can understand how big it'll typically get in a landscape or garden under a regular environmental condition.
Super cool plant though. We got there and it was a great fall color. This is a precursor to Ryusin or Jiro Shidari. Jiro Shidari was actually a seedling from this. It's like the best of our friends, but just really cool tree to see. Fiery orangey red. We've actually been producing this one in our nursery, but it's kind of the precursor to all of those future weeping forms. Like that Dragon Master would be the great grandbaby of one of these.
And when we first heard about this years and years ago, it was this rumor of this plant that was on a hill that monks guarded.
Didn't see any of that when I got there. Luckily, there was no threats.
And lucky for us, someone else had brought it into the country, and we were able to graft it, produce it, and really get it growing. And this is a plant that I just love. I mean, when you see a plant of that stature and that age, and I mean, it just makes your jaw drop, and you're like, wow, that is spectacular. And it's one of the oldest Japanese maples ever recorded on how old it actually is, especially of one that has a cultivar name to it.
This was in the Fukushima prefecture, so where a lot of things went wrong with the tsunami in that region. Really cool. It's still there. It still looks great. This was actually post-tsunami when we took the pictures of this one.
And they do think at some point this one's going to pass away, so they have sister seedlings or maybe even rooted cuttings. We couldn't quite understand the translation that are right beside of it. That's hopefully, it's already over 100 years old.
The baby's from it. Maybe.
Yeah, and so they're hoping that once this one passes away, that legacy will continue with the ones around it. But pretty amazing plant, and I mean, it's so unusual to see something like that.
Now, Cigar Nishiki is one that's been around a bit, but it's always popular. What I love about this one is it's that bordered variegation. It's a very unique style variegation within Japanese maples. This one gets like a gold flaking around every single leaf. And really showy plant. Nice, large, crisp green foliage. As the summer goes on, typically it gets even more yellow into the interior parts.
Now the fall colors are oranges, a lot of oranges with some reds. So you really get all the colors in this plant from green, yellow, orange, and red. But to me, this is a plant that if you can give it the right exposure with morning sun, afternoon shade, you really peak the most out of this plant and get the best variegation that's unlike anything else. And that's the reason I love this plant, is because it's truly different and unique, and there's not a lot of other Japanese maples quite like it.
Firefall. Now this is a newer selection of lace leaf. We've got this far in the presentation and we hadn't talked about any lace leaves. Probably the top selling plants are lace leaves for most everybody. We've really been impressed with this one in the deep south for its heat tolerance. We've got some of these growing in Augusta, Georgia in full sun, and they're just looking great. It's been an exceptionally durable plant, but it's also been one that's held its color really well. It's held that bright kind of picked up pink red and then had some exceptional fall colors, even for our customers in the deep south.
So if you're growing Tamukiyama, Nabashidari, Crimson Queen, you put those, Red Dragon, you put those in a pile and you put a Firefall in it, that picked up red color, it's brighter. It's not that deeper maroon that you typically get on other red lace leaves. That picked up red really stands out, and it's going to be something people walk to because it truly is redder rather than that darker red-brown color that you may get with some of the other varieties. Holds that color very well throughout the season. It's got a very traditional size and traditional shape, as most of your red lace leaves, but the color on this is so much more picked up. It's definitely one that people will pick and grab first rather than many of the other red lace leaves.
So Sir Damon is a newer coral bark introduction. Typically we list our coral barks now as zone 6 through zone 9. So we have taken those out of zone 5. Typically they got thinner cambium, so they're not quite as suited for the zone 5 environment. The reason we like Sir Damon is because it's more of a pink red. So you get even a more intense bark interest to this than Sengukaku. Sengukaku is always, the nursery standard for that bright red winter interest. And Sir Damon just puts a little more pink in there, and it shows out just a little bit more in that winter garden because of that pink.
Yeah, I mean, all of y'all have seen a coral bark Japanese maple, and this just adds that extra flair on a coral bark Japanese maple that just gives a little more dynamically interesting color out in the landscape. And again, it's your green leaves like your typical coral bark, typical yellow fall color, but that bark color is just so more picked up that it's going to grab people's interest out there in the landscape and garden.
Sayo is a really interesting dwarf. It's very popular for bonsai. It's one of the smallest leaf Japanese maples we do. I'm no bonsai expert by any means, but it's one that works really well with the pinchback method because it already has really, really, really small foliage. Now this one, unlike many of the other hime forms like Murasaki Kiyohime or Kiyohime or Hime Sojo and some of those, this one tends to be more of a small globe shape rather than like a toadstool little dome. So instead of, like Murasaki Kiyohime as you grow it out tends to be more of a small dome, and this one's going to be more of a globe overall. Really cool for bonsai though because it puts on a lot of interior branching, so you can do a lot with this one, and also has a really nice purple border to each leaf in the early spring. But even on its own without the pinchback method, tiny foliage.
And one of the reasons we love this one too, it's a vigorous dwarf. That sounds like an oxymoron, and it really is, but this thing takes out and gets out the gates really quickly, so it fills out a 1 gallon, fills out a 3 gallon, fills out a 5 gallon fairly fast, and then starts densening up. So it will become more and more dense as it ages, but it makes a 3 or 5 gallon very quickly for a Japanese maple. And with that unique habit and that color on the spring and that extremely small foliage, it's one that a lot of people would gravitate to because it's very unique and it is very different. And
now this one's always popular for containers. We do recommend container gardening, a zone down. So typically if you leave a Japanese maple in a pot, it's going to take it down 1 zone for cold tolerance. So this one typically works zones 5 through 9, but in a container, and if you're leaving it out year round, you're going to have to protect that container in a zone 5.
So next up, we've got one of the first more upright red lace leaves. And we've grown a lot of varieties like Garnet Towers that have a slight upright structure, but for red upright, English lace has the most upright of any of the red lace leaves.
And this one isn't quite as vigorous as Sayo, which is the green upright. It's going to be more like that 10 to 12 foot range, where Sayo puts on over a foot of growth a year. It's not uncommon for Sayo, even in 15 years to reach 20 feet. English lace is still the best upright red lace leaf. So we got to evaluate this one very early on. One of the fun things we do at our nursery is because we have so many varieties, other nurseries will often send us new introductions to kind of evaluate against. And we got to grow this one before it was named and help pick which of the multiple seedlings eventually turned into the English lace.
Yeah, and English lace, this was one that we've just continued to like because it's a faster growing red lace leaf. I mean, if someone was doing field growing for lace leaves, this thing's going to get out there pretty quickly. And that's the reason we like it. We typically recommend staking this plant for the first couple years to point it up in the right direction, because sometimes grafting off of a side branch or more lateral branch will cause this one to start growing more lateral at a young age. You point it up in the right direction, and this thing seems to take off and really makes this tree, it's a fast-growing red lace leaf.
Yeah, and it's a more open, airy look to it as it finishes, too. It's going to be more of a tree that you kind of look up into rather than what you think of as low cascading umbrella.
And if you're looking for a lace leaf that you want to do that floating cloud-style method of bonsai pruning or pruning out in the landscape to where you have the branches opened up with the airier look, this one's a fantastic one to do it with because it has a more natural, open, airy shape. It's going to be much easier to do this than many of the other lace leaf styles because of that.
Twomboys Red Sentinel. You may be familiar with this one. We're very big on this one in our nursery. It's been around a while. It was introduced by Ken Twombly. It's we don't really have a good term for it. So like witch's brooms are these genetic mutations that occur in Japanese maples. And typically when you find a witch's broom, it's more of a small ball shape. And this one tends to be a very columnar shape to it. So it tends to be more of a narrow, thin habit. Now I do find that putting this one in sun makes it more narrow, and also not allowing it to have a ton of multi-branches when it's young. So if you prune this one back heavy and you're taking out the central leader when it's a younger plant, you are going to create a wider plant. If you're leaving that central leader in it, it's going to be a much more narrow plant. And we get them out in the landscape, and we get some great narrow habits to these. It's a more picked up bright red, so it works really well for us in the deep south, even for our customers who are in a hotter zone. It's a very, very durable plant for that. But you also get this really fiery bright red fall color too.
I also think that fertilization may make a big difference on this one. If you fertilize this one constantly, you may get a wider plant, and you may get a lot less of those short and center nodes that you find on witch's brooms, and that just makes this plant grow a little bit wider overall.
It's kind of outgrown its the thing that makes it small.
But the best thing about this plant is it's a flagpole color out in the landscape and garden. I mean, you put this out there in the landscape, and it doesn't take up a lot of space. It gives you that red color as it grows up taller. Good cherry red color during the spring, good maroon during parts of the summer, and a great bright red fall color. But at the same time, you've got a plant that's very narrow. So you can use this in places where you don't want to put a lot of shade out in the landscape, but you want something that's going to give you a lot of color, or just that unique texture of having something tall and narrow out in the landscape adds a lot to this. I've seen some people use this as a screen, which I think is a pretty cool way to do it, because you could do a screen of, it'd be a deciduous screen, but a screen of Japanese maples, because they're so narrow in their habit, they're not going to take up a lot of space.
So we went from a skinny plant to a very wide plant. Jermaines gyration is a fun plant because it looks like a really old tree really quickly. We list this one as typically 10 by 10 and 10 years, so it's going to give you more of that longwood gardens type look. You're going to get a Biltmore House type tree and a much younger tree. It's definitely one you're going to need space for because of that, because it gets out there, very, very quickly. It's not uncommon for this one to, we shot an episode of Growing a Greener World, and we come back and did a reshoot with that tree less than a year, and it was already very different looking than in the original shoot, because it puts on a lot of growth for a lace leaf.
Now, Matt and I have been doing this for quite a while, and we'd have people come visit the nursery and spend a long time at the nursery. And I had a 92-year-old lady come, and she was shopping at the nursery, and she said, "Now, are this going to get big in my lifetime?" I'm like, "Well, this plant grows as one of the fastest-growing Japanese maples that we do." I showed her around the rest of the nursery, and she said, "I think I'm going to go with that fast-growing Jermaines gyration." And I reached down to pick it up for her, and this 92-year-old lady pinches me on the butt. And then I turn around and look at her, and she says, "I still got it." And so,
so he told this story. He loves to tell this story, but he told this story one time to a garden club, and I'm like, "Dude, she's in here. Like, that lady's right there."
It was 2 years later. She was 94, and she was in the crowd, yeah. But Jermaines gyration, this plant gets out there quickly. I mean, this is a Japanese maple that grows relatively fast. Again, if you're looking for a field-growing lace leaf, this is a plant that makes that specimen that people can enjoy that looks like a 200-year-old specimen in a short period of time.
It's one you're definitely going to want to leave room for. I wouldn't crowd this one too much because it does fill out quite nicely. It has a large foliage to it, a crisp green foliage. It's kind of a light green, especially like a chartreuse green in the early spring. Goes to a really bold, like golden yellow to orangey yellow in the fall.
And as you can see, it just has this contorted shape to it. I mean, this is in Spartanburg at Bill and Kristen Taylor's, and it just has this contorted habit to it, which gives it a very unique branch structure, so you can enjoy the plant even when it's out of leaf. And it does this naturally. You can prune and accentuate this, but it's just that twisted, contorted habit really makes this plant shine out in the landscape and garden.
Moonrise. Now, many of you probably know Moonrise. Introduction by our friend Carl Munn. Great plant. It's really getting popular in Europe. Another Acer Oliveratum that we're big fans of. This one's a great grower for us in the south. It tends to fill out quicker than many of the other Acer Oliveratums. But what makes this one so popular is that it gets this funky new growth. Like, it can get apricot pinks and yellows all going on at the same time, especially in the early spring. This is a larger specimen we have there in full sun in zone 6B. And that tree is probably every bit of 10 to 12 foot tall and 10 to 12 foot wide.
And it's a plant that does fairly well in colder climates. One of the photos we actually use on our website is a photo by Chris Hansen of the Chick Charms, here pretty local. And Moonrise is a plant that just shines. I mean, it just keeps putting on new growth after new growth after new growth of color with that lime green to yellow color. It's one that always shows out in the landscape and garden. Where we're at in the south with Autumn Moon, it's a very similar looking plant. This one has a little bit brighter colors, but Autumn Moon, we have to be very careful where we place it. I often say you put it in a container, you find its happy spot, and then once you find its happy spot, then you put it in the ground. That's not the case with Moonrise. This is a plant that almost anybody can put out in the landscape and garden, sun, partial shade, and this plant's going to thrive and do well out there for people. And that's one of its easeability for people to use out in the landscape. This plant is amazing, but the colors on this are just outrageous how it just keeps putting on new growth colors.
Geisha Gone Wild, another fun pink one. This is another one that kind of breaks the rules for heat tolerance. It's a very durable pink on red. So this one has a swirling variegation. It's actually a sport mutation off the cultivar Geisha, so I guess it went wild. Very similar to Shiraz, which occurred independently of Geisha Gone Wild in New Zealand. Now we've actually found the same sport at our nursery and at a friend's nursery, but we don't need like 4 plants that are also similar. So this one is very similar to Shiraz. Geisha Gone Wild was named by Talon Buchholz, and it is an intense pink on red. You get those high shades of bright pink on red. I actually like this one the most midsummer when you start to get some green in it, because I think it's one of the most funky colors when you got that pink and like green combo going on.
But if someone says they want a pink tree out in their landscape, I mean, the spring color on this is outrageous. My wife, we were doing different YouTube videos, and Matt's wife introduced a video of a tree that he'd named after her, and my wife said, I want to do that Geisha Gone Wild video because that color, I just love that plant. And the pink on this is just outstanding. Late summer, you may get some green on creams if you grow this tree in full sun, but the fall color returns to a pink on red. I mean, this is a plant that is just fantastic to use out there. You pair this with, I always say pair it with the yellows because that's the most color contrast you can get. But you pair this with a yellow out there, and it's going to dynamically make that landscape just show off.
Yeah, awesome plant. Another one that, the foliage is the flower. This one's got all the high drama of a flower and shrub, but in a Japanese maple.
So this is one of our best introductions to date. We are trialing it right now in Zone 5. We listed it as a Zone 6 currently, but all indicators are showing that it may be a good Zone 5 plant as well, but we've just got to continue that trial process with it.
Yeah, we often look at how to put superpowers, into our Japanese maples. We're big comic book geeks too, so we like to add superpowers to them. So this is actually an Acer Oliveratum X Palmatum. So it's a Chinese maple. For most of our customers, it's going to look exactly like a Japanese maple. They're going to look at that and go, it's a Japanese maple. But what's special about Acer Oliveratum is they come from even hotter zones in China. So they have that added heat tolerance. So this is one as a yellow that people can put out in a full sun, zone 8 environment, maybe even in like Atlanta, Georgia, where it's a lot higher picked up humidity and heat. And it's going to do excellent for them. It actually likes the sunlight, and it's very fast growing. Now this one goes from holding a very bright yellow to a light green midsummer, and then a picked up very pink red in the fall. So we actually have a whole heat seeker series where we have Acer Oliveratum X Palmatums that have kind of this added superpower, being a little bit more heat tolerant.
And this is the only one that we started trials with in Zone 5 when it comes to the Acer Oliveratums. Typically, Acer Oliveratum is rated to Zone 6. Acer Oliveratum variety Formosanum is rated to Zone 7. But this one has, it could be the fact that it's got that hybrid with your typical Japanese maple that's allowing it to go colder and colder. We think it could be a Palmatum. It could be an Acer Shirosaulinum that this is a hybrid with. But what we get out of this plant is just this amazing yellow color. And where many Japanese maples, they're heat tolerant, that means they're resistant to the sunlight, they're resistant to that heat. This is one that thrives when you give it the sunlight. It prefers the sunlight. And so it takes off in more sunlight situations. And I've seen this plant grow 2 to 3 feet of growth in a year. It's one of the fastest growing maples that we currently do. But the fall colors on it are just some electric reds. And midsummer, you can see it'll get this pink-orange new growth to it. It's pretty spectacular. We've had many people from Europe wanting to patent this in Europe and just give us the royalties off of it, but we didn't quite do that. But this is a plant that I think you're going to see more and more in the nursery trade in the next few years because a lot of the...
Not only for the color, but also for the vigor because it fills out a 3-gallon really quickly.
But if you wonder where the name came from, Matt gets credit for this one.
Yeah, I got some extra credit. I named this stuff for my wife, Hot Blonde, so she liked it. And we were originally, we chickened out. We were going to another name, and a friend of ours said, I have that name as a trademark. So I said, it was meant to be. We're sticking with Hot Blonde. And it started our whole Heat Seeker series. We now have a hot sauce and a hot tamale and more to come. But yeah, there's some of those more heat-tolerant traits that you can incorporate into maples, which can push them even zones further. So really cool.
Yeah, whenever it comes to Japanese maples, we're tree geeks. And if you find something that's out there, you find a witch's broom, you find a mutation out in your landscape or in your garden center, send us a photo because we can tell you, hey, is this unique? Is this different? And if you need someone to produce it, we're definitely interested.
This photo is in Kyoto. We went to Arashima Monkey Park, and there were monkeys sitting in Japanese maples all over this park. I don't know if this picture's in a maple, but they're all over the Japanese maples there. Just a cool way to see them.
Matt really wanted to see this. See, whenever I traveled to Japan, I make this huge itinerary of places to go with backup places to go. I figure out their GPS coordinates. I know exactly where I'm going to be going. I can plug this into a GPS. Even if I don't speak Japanese, I can plug in the coordinates.
And we can law school.
We can find this. Well, Matt called an audible and said, I hear there's a monkey park. I want to see a monkey in a Japanese maple. We're going. And so we got lost. We probably spent 2 or 3 hours trying to find this place. And there were signs everywhere, but we couldn't read them because they were in Japanese. And the signs with monkeys, and we're like,
best food Kyoto you'll ever see, though.
Yeah.
Any questions on Japanese maples? We'll open it up for questions now. Yes.
Do you prefer to use synthetic or organic fertilizer on the maples in general? I mean, we just are curious.
So our recommendation with fertilizers are low nitrogen. I think one of the biggest problems with maples, especially in colder zones, are being overpushed. And so you can get a bad name for maples if they, like we could get a 6-foot, blood good in a year, but it just wouldn't have the cell walls for the colder climates. We're in zone 6B2, and it's not uncommon for us to get -10 there. And so we're always conscious of this. And we cut off all of our fertilizing in May on any granulated mixes. So we use some granulated mixes for sure. You have to be conscious of that release date's the main thing, because even your organics can put too much nitrogen into them late. And I would caution more, not one or the other, but just not too high nitrogen. I typically go 15 or lower on that nitrogen, and then not too late into the season. Cutting it off in May gives that plenty of time to release. If it's a heat released or a water release soluble, you're getting all that energy out. I often let our customers know, some of those fertilizers you're putting out have a 120-day release. So if you're putting that out in August, your tree's way too active for that cold spell. You're going to be pushing growth, and it's going to get nipped back for sure if you're over pushing it. So I do tend to avoid a lot of the home remedy ones just because they can be so high in nitrogen that will surprise people. At least if with some of those you're getting a more standardized nitrogen base there, but just not too late is really the goal there. Both work fine.
And one thing to remember, in colder zones, especially zone 5, there's a lot of room for error for people with fertilizers. And I always remind them and say, hey, if you're fertilizing late in the season, this can cause damage. If you're letting this fertilizer stick around on this plant late in the season, this can cause damage.
We'll have customers that are like, I don't want my tree to get big. I'm throwing massive amounts of fertilizer on it. Well, why are you doing that? You don't need to fertilize at all. Just let it do its thing. Let it grow at a more moderate pace. Light pruning in early spring can increase the growth rate and take out twiggier growth. But just be more cautious than not with fertilizers because you can over push it.
And over pushing just makes them more likely to crack at the base during the winter, more likely to have issues with disease. So the best thing to do is just encourage them not to over fertilize. The guy who wrote the book on Japanese maples, he said in his book, you don't have to use fertilizer at all. And he encourages people not to use fertilizer. And I think that's because of all the mistakes people can make. I mean, the Japanese maples really grow better and they grow faster when you do fertilize them. But you just have to be careful to make sure that fertilizer shut off. You want to make sure that that's just not continually pushing during those winter months.
Yes, sir.
Do you have any Japanese maples that get the thickness faster?
Like caliper, like developing that. Yeah.
For dwarfs, that's Sayo. For a Sayo, that is one of the Japanese maples that develops a thicker caliper on it fairly quickly.
Most of that does come with age. You know, a lot of the bonsai guys want them to be massive right at the get-go, and you've got a tree this big with a really nice size base to it. And a lot of that does have to come with age, unfortunately. But there are some that are a little bit faster.
You will find, too, that there's different styles of leaves on a Japanese maple. There's your Palmatum, which is typically your smaller leaf. Your Matsumuri, which is the more divided back leaves that includes a lot of the lace leaves. And then you've got your Acer Amoenums, which is that little bit larger leaf, like a bloodgood style. You will find that Amoenum style does get a thicker trunk faster than the rest. But that, again, that still comes with age whenever it comes to your Japanese maples.
Cool. Yeah, we're back here.
What factors do you determine when to go with seeding or grafting?
Well, all of our named varieties, I like to tell people to think of it kind of like breeds of dogs. So if it is a named variety, it needs to be grafted. If any of the trees that are from seed won't be true from form. So one of the biggest misnomers in Japanese maples is people selling bloodgood seedlings as bloodgood. It can be a great plant, but it shouldn't have a cultivar name on it. By grafting, we've locked in and cloned those traits, and so we have kind of a more secured way of knowing that you're getting a Great Dane instead of a Chihuahua, and a Chihuahua instead of a Great Dane. Where from seed, I often tell people, check out Tim and I. We're brothers. We don't look exactly alike, and that's exactly what happens. You'll get a huge level of genetic drift there with Japanese maples, where some look more like the parent plant, but you might get a 30-foot tree or a weeping tree. So from seed, there's so much more variability, and a graft is the only way to have a true named variety. That said, my grandmother, some of my favorite trees were trees she grew from seed. You can get great Japanese maples from seed, but it's almost like thinking of a mutt versus a breed of dog. You kind of know a little bit more about what you're getting.
Like Matt can handle full sun. I need protection from the hot afternoon sun. And that's the way you get with the seeds, too. They may look similar, they can be very different from seed.
What's your base?
So what we graft to is Acer Palmatum subspecies Palmatum. It's a very basic small leaf green. And that's kind of one of the industry standards. One of the reasons it's used is it's very disease resistant and it heals quicker. You could do a bunch of things, but they might not have as high yield. They might not take as well. We grow a lot of trees from seed that my grandmother was planting in the 1950s, and they're Acer Palmatum subspecies Palmatum. And we like that they've got a lot of good genetics to them already. They've been through all these different winters with us, but also they heal quickly and they make a good, durable root system. So by grafting the tree, we've actually improved that root system. You could do rooted cuttings, right? There are rooted cuttings. Like people go, I rooted Japanese maples. Like, yeah, I've rooted thousands. But it does decrease over time the longevity of that plant. A grafted tree tends to outperform it, especially with something like a lace leaf, which are most of our most popular trees. A rooted cutting lace leaf is just a little bit more finicky in the landscape.
The story goes this nursery in New Jersey put tons and tons of Sayo out in the landscape and garden, which is an upright out in the landscape. And they were doing field-grown Sayo. And they were doing it by rooted cutting, which you can do. And after the first year, they'd lost about half their plants due to disease. And because the clonal root systems just allow the disease to uptake through the plants so easily. And then after about the next year, they lost another 50% of them. And the next year, they lost another 50% of them. And then they're starting to think, should I sell these and cut my losses? Or is the customer that I sell to just going to have the same problem? And that's one of the reasons why we graft, is to prevent a lot of disease when it comes to Japanese maples. Rooted cuttings can happen. You can do it. It can look out in the landscape and look decent. But the more you have that plant out in the landscape or in a container, you really have to treat constantly to try to keep it from catching something if it's not grafted, if it's just by rooted cutting. And we had a gentleman come present at the Maple Society who was all about bonsai and rooted cuttings with maples. I mean, he does fantastic bonsai. And he said the same thing. He said, yeah, if you're putting out in the landscape, graft it. He said, even if you're growing in a container, graft it unless you're going to constantly go out there and treat it for fungus so that it's not catching those funguses.
Yes?
What sort of traits are akin to the word Nishiki in Japanese?
Yeah, so you see like Nishiki a lot. We were joking earlier, it's Nishiki, or we say Nishiki because that's actually, it's just funny how Romanji works, because it's like, it's like Pennsylvaticum is just written wrong, and so it's that way no matter what. It's supposed to be Pennsylvania, right? So we break the rules a lot, but really Romanji is how it sounded when a Japanese nurseryman said it. And so Nishiki typically refers to variegated plants, but not always. It basically means like brocade or beautiful as a breakdown of what it means. And you'll find awesome plants like Yuzo Nishiki always fools people. Like, well, my Yuzo Nishiki is not variegated. Well, it's a beautiful upright red that has Nishiki in it. So there's some exceptions to that. In general, most of the ones that have that are variegated, but not all.
And Nishikigawa, I mean, that's a very popular plant. It's a pine bark Japanese maple is the common name for it. And the Nishiki there simply means it has brocaded bark. It has very beautiful bark for that cultivar.
But yeah, you'll see that one repeated a ton.
And not just in Japanese maples, but all across plants. They're like Nishiki, and you're like, oh, most of the time you're going to think that's going to be variegated.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Just a weird novelty question. Have you ever grafted, say, 5 different varieties onto a
Yeah, that's something that happens a lot. It's called a Dantsugi. It's actually, we were doing a video on Yokohama Nursery, and they were offering Dantsugi grafts around like, was it 1800?
1890
in the United States. So it was like multiple trees onto one. It certainly can be done. I need to do a whole video on this because people ask this a lot, and it's a fun way to do it. What tends to happen is you must maintain that balance between the two. Like I had a green lace leaf on a Dantsugi that I'd grafted with a red weeping lace leaf. Looked great. Well, I put it in my uncle's yard, and I didn't do anything with it for like 10 years. Well, now it's all one green lace leaf. You have to kind of maintain that balance. Typically, one of the cultivars does become a little bit more dominant over it. In that same garden, I have a gift a friend gave me, and it has a Crimson Queen, and somebody grafted a Shishigashira in it. And it still looks great because the Shishigashira grew up, and you know it's actually grafted into the Crimson Queen. Kind of looks like a ballerina. It's got like a little skirt and then an upright part. And so a friend of mine gave me that one as a gift. And so it can be done where it doesn't require a ton of maintenance, but one tends to dominate the other is the honest answer. The one that's going to take up energy more efficiently is typically the green one. And so what's going to happen long term is that green one tends to start sucking energy out of the other one. And eventually, unless you're pruning to maintain that balance, one tends to win.
And the problem with that is the more you prune on a plant, it also, if you do that in the early spring before it leaves out, you're also promoting that part of the plant to grow. So if you're out there always constantly pruning on the bigger plant trying to cut it back, you're just encouraging that to constantly keep growing. So you have to do a late summer pruning and try to keep pruning back when those carbohydrates are in the branches. You have to cut it back, the one that's bigger then.
Right.
And
it can be really cool, though. It just has to be maintained.
But typically the green or the more dominant cultivar starts to get more access to the roots and starts to take over the entire plant.
The other part just slowly shrinks away. Like I went and picked up the green lace leaf, and I could see the branch where my red was originally grafted, and I was like, man, I really should have maintained this one more.
So it's a very novelty type item, but
it can be done.
It can be done. You just it requires a lot of work, and then you have to realize when to do that work is during the summer rather than during the spring. Because as you may know, people will go out there and prune back a water sprout on a sengukaku, and then all of a sudden that sprout just gets bigger and bigger unless they prune all across the plant, and then you get uniform growth across the plant. And you just have to figure out, what am I doing here? Because every time you're pruning, if you're pruning in the early spring right before it's leafing out, you're promoting that growth rather than taking it away.
Yeah, but cool way to do it. I've seen some really beautiful ones. Any other questions? I think we'll wrap up there. One more.
For the hot blonde, I'm not too familiar with the Chinese maples. You said it's good like for heat tolerance and everything. Is it like pretty good cold-wise too?
Well, that one's going to work. We're listing it zone 6 through 9 right now, just as a kind of a being careful. We think it probably can do zone 5. I actually have tons of customers with that one in zone 5. We think that it's also benefiting from that Palmatum or sure Asylum relationship that it has with the Acer Oliveratum, so there's a little bit of cold tolerance with it as well. What that one's really been popular for is full sun and very high heat conditions, even further south. So people are growing that one, in conditions like Dallas or Columbia, South Carolina, where a lot of other trees are experiencing a lot more leaf burn in full sun, and it's not experiencing that. Now, we do a whole trying to give maples superpowers for colder climates too. I'm sure you're familiar with Acer Pseudosiboldianum, and we're working on several hybrids that we're naming at our nursery as well for that. So maybe we'll come back in a couple years and talk about Acer Pseudosiboldianum hybrids for super cold zones.
But we are having, it is being trialed right now in zone 5, and I think so the first few years it's been doing pretty well, but it's just, you have to get it enough in evaluation and enough colder temperatures to really able to say, hey, this plant's going to do well in a zone 5. But all indicators,
it seems pretty promising.
it seems very promising. And where it was, we collected seed on it, there was only one other yellow cultivar in that large collection, and that was Acer Shirasawanamarium. So it may be actually a hybrid with Acer Shirasawanam. And as many of y'all might have heard me talk about the Shirasawanams during the polar vortex really stood up very well because they were a little more cold tolerant than some of the Palmatums. And so it'll be interesting to see as we trial this to see exactly where hot blonde can actually go and if it's where that cold tolerance is and where it comes from. And we've had some people that said they could do some genetic work on this, and we'd be interested in, we're thinking about doing that to try to figure out what that other half was, because, I mean, you can guess what this came off of. And my guess would be an Acer Shirasawanam, but it very much could have been a Palmatum. But you look at it and you really don't know until you do the genetic work, because we collected it as a chance seed off of the parent. We know what the parent was, but we don't know what the other parent was.
Hey, thanks so much for coming today, guys. Definitely sub to the Mr. Maple show. She said there was a way you could evaluate the speakers as well.
That's on the QR code.
Awesome.
Yes.
So yeah, go out this door if you're going to give us a bad review, and go out that door near that if you're going to. Thanks again.